Now look, I want you to sit with me for a minute on this one, because a single number on a page rarely tells the whole story, and tonight's new polling is exactly that kind of number. It's the middle of primary season, the kind of stretch where campaigns live and die by data they can't fully control, and a fresh poll drops that catches almost everyone off guard. On the surface, this looks like just one more data point in an endless stream of surveys that flood every election cycle. But if you look closer, and I mean really look, it tells you something about where the actual voters, not the pundits, are moving right now. And most people who saw the top line number tonight didn't realize what's actually buried underneath it in the crosstabs, where the real story usually lives. This touches which candidates get taken seriously by donors and party leaders in the next crucial weeks, which is often more consequential to a primary's outcome than anything a candidate actually says on a debate stage. Here's what I want you to hold on to before we go further. There's a specific subgroup shift in this poll that changes the entire read on where this primary is headed. And we're going to come back to it, because once you understand it, the top line number means something completely different. And there's another poll coming out in the next stretch of days that will either confirm or completely contradict tonight's numbers, and which one turns out to be right will matter enormously. Hold on to both. We'll get there. I've watched enough polling cycles come and go to know exactly how tonight tends to unfold. The top line number gets shared 1,000 times within the hour, stripped of all context, doing more to shape opinion than to inform it. I want to do this differently with you tonight. Stay with me, and we'll take this poll apart the way any honest analyst actually would, piece by piece, before we draw a single conclusion. To understand tonight, you've got to understand how a primary actually moves beneath the surface, because the public narrative and the private data rarely move in lockstep. Primaries are strange contests, lower turnout than general elections, more ideologically engaged voters, and a media environment that often covers the horse race more intensely than the substance, because the horse race is what's uncertain, and substance in a primary among candidates from the same party is often more similar than different. In that environment, polling becomes unusually powerful, not because it's more accurate than in a general election, but because it shapes perception, and perception shapes fundraising, endorsements, and media coverage, which in turn shapes the actual outcome. Polling in a primary isn't just a measurement. It's an input into the very race it's measuring. Every decision echoes for years. What we're watching tonight is the echo of decisions candidates made months ago about which voters to court, which issues to emphasize, which coalition within the party to try to assemble. A campaign that built its entire strategy around one demographic or one region finds out in moments like tonight's poll release whether that bet paid off or whether the electorate shifted in ways the campaign didn't anticipate. Every campaign strategy is, at bottom, a bet placed months in advance about what the electorate would look like on a specific future date, and polls like tonight's are the first real evidence of whether that bet is paying off. Think about how a campaign actually plans its calendar. Months before the first vote is cast, strategists sit down with the electoral map and make a series of judgment calls. Which regions to prioritize with limited travel time, which demographic groups to target with the bulk of the advertising budget, which issues to lead with in the first wave of messaging, and which to hold in reserve for later. Every one of those choices is a bet on what the electorate will look like and what it will care about months down the road, made with incomplete information and no ability to take it back once resources are committed. Tonight's poll is the first hard evidence of whether those early bets were sound. And here's the part that rarely gets discussed honestly. Campaigns rarely abandon a strategy quickly, even when early evidence suggests it isn't working. Because pivoting has real costs, organizational costs, message discipline costs. The simple embarrassment of admitting an earlier bet was wrong. That reluctance to pivot means primaries often take longer to reflect genuine shifts in the electorate than they should. With campaigns doubling down on an original strategy well past the point where the data suggested a change was needed. Watching whether a campaign adjusts its messaging in the days following a poll like tonight's tells you almost as much about that campaign's internal culture as the poll itself tells you about the race. Let me be precise, because the details matter more than anybody's spin. A single poll is a snapshot built from a sample of a few hundred to a couple thousand respondents, with a margin of error typically in the range of 3 to 4 percentage points either direction. That means two candidates separated by 5 or 6 points might genuinely be roughly tied, while two candidates separated by 15 or 20 points almost certainly reflect a real gap, even accounting for methodological noise. The single most important thing to check before reacting to any poll is the sample. Who was surveyed, how they were reached, whether the sample was weighted to reflect the likely composition of actual primary voters, who tend to be older, more habitual voters than the general population. Watch too for the difference between a poll of registered voters and a poll of likely voters, because in a primary, that distinction can swing results by a meaningful margin. Likely voter models try to filter for people who will actually show up based on past voting history and stated intention. And different pollsters build those models differently, which is one reason two polls released in the same week covering the same primary can show meaningfully different results without either one being wrong. Look too at the specific dates the poll was conducted, because a poll taken before a major news event, a debate, an endorsement, a controversy may already be stale by the time it's published, even if the methodology was sound. Let me be even more precise about the mechanics of a credible poll, because these details separate rigorous surveys from noise dressed up as data. Reputable pollsters disclose their sample size, their margin of error, their field dates, and their methodology, whether respondents were reached by live telephone interview, automated calls, online panels, or some blend of methods. Live caller phone polls remain by most measures among the more reliable methods, though they've become significantly more expensive and harder to field as response rates have declined industry-wide. Online panel polls can be excellent when built and weighted carefully, but vary enormously in quality depending on how the panel was recruited and maintained. When a poll doesn't disclose its methodology in reasonable detail, that alone is a signal to treat the top-line number with real caution, regardless of how favorable or unfavorable it looks for your preferred candidate. Also worth checking, who commissioned the poll? Internal campaign polls released selectively by a campaign itself are not inherently dishonest, but they are inherently more likely to be released only when the numbers are favorable, which creates a structural bias in what gets shared publicly even when the underlying methodology is sound. Independent polls commissioned by media organizations or academic institutions with no stake in a particular outcome generally deserve more weight, precisely because they get released regardless of which candidate they happen to favor. Now let me put my analyst hat on for a minute, because the strategy here is worth examining honestly. New polling reshapes a primary in three distinct ways, and understanding all three is what separates a sophisticated read from a superficial one. The first way is the donor effect. Major donors, particularly the ones capable of writing the checks that fund the expensive final stretch of a campaign, are watching these numbers closely, and they tend to be risk-averse. A candidate who shows momentum in fresh polling finds fundraising calls easier to make and easier to close. A candidate who shows stagnation or decline finds the opposite. Donors who are on the fence start looking elsewhere, not necessarily out of any judgment about the candidate's merits, but simply because donors want to back a plausible winner, and polling is the most visible signal of plausibility available to them. The second way is the media oxygen effect. Debate stage placement, the amount of speaking time a moderator allots, which candidates get profiled in major outlets, which candidates get invited onto influential shows. All of this is shaped, directly or indirectly, by polling. A candidate polling in single digits gets treated by the media as a long shot, regardless of the substance of their platform, and that treatment becomes self-reinforcing because reduced media exposure makes it harder to climb in the very polls used to justify the reduced exposure in the first place. This dynamic, more than any other, is why early polling in a primary can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the third way is the strategic voting effect, which becomes especially powerful as a primary nears its final weeks. Voters who might personally prefer a candidate polling in fourth or fifth place start asking themselves whether that vote is wasted and start migrating toward whichever candidate polling suggests is best positioned to win, particularly if there's a strong incentive to consolidate against a frontrunner the voter opposes. So ask yourself the honest question: which candidates are most vulnerable to losing supporters, not because voters changed their minds about them, but because voters recalculated the odds based on tonight's numbers? That's often the more consequential effect than any shift in genuine preference. There's a fourth effect worth naming as well, one that operates quietly but powerfully behind the scenes. The endorsement calculus of sitting officials and party figures who haven't yet weighed in publicly. These are people managing their own political futures, and they tend to wait for genuine clarity before attaching their name to a candidate, precisely because an early endorsement of a candidate who later falters can cost them credibility with their own constituents. A poll like tonight's, if it shows genuine separation between candidates, can trigger a wave of these strategic endorsements in the following days. As officials who were waiting on the sidelines decide the risk of staying silent now outweighs the risk of picking a side. Watch for exactly that pattern in the coming week. It's often a more reliable signal of where real momentum lies than the raw polling number itself. Now, I want to be fair here, because this isn't about one party, and it never really is. I've watched candidates and their supporters on every part of the political spectrum treat favorable polls as gospel and unfavorable polls as fake or rigged.